Breaking tonight, the Congressional Budget Office just issued a warning that should terrify every American taxpayer. The fiscal trajectory of the United States is, and I'm quoting the CBO directly here, not sustainable. American national debt just crossed $38.6 trillion, and it's heading toward 175% of GDP by 2056. But here's what no one in Washington seems willing to say out loud. The debt number alone isn't what's destroying confidence. It's the complete absence of any mechanism to fix it. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada is sitting in one of the strongest fiscal positions in the entire developed world. And tonight we're going to show you exactly why. Everyone assumed America's debt dominance was permanent. Wall Street treated U.S. Treasuries as the undisputed safe haven of global finance. Analysts insisted the dollar's reserve status made American borrowing essentially consequence-free. Congress kept raising the debt ceiling like it was a formality. They were all making the same dangerous miscalculation. Washington, May 2025. The CBO releases its updated long-term budget outlook, and the numbers land like a shockwave across bond markets. Trump's policies alone added $1.4 trillion to the 10-year deficit projection in a single year. The 2025 Reconciliation Act? That alone adds $4.7 trillion in deficits through 2035. Tariff revenue, a separate gamble that may not even survive legal challenges, offsets only $3 trillion. And administrative actions reducing immigration, another $500 billion added to the deficit. Translation: Washington isn't just spending recklessly, it's legislating recklessness into the system with no corrective mechanism in sight. And what happened next? The gap between American and Canadian borrowing costs widened to levels not seen since 1870. Bond markets started doing what politicians refused to do. They started telling the truth. Dear viewers, to understand why this matters, you need to understand the difference between debt levels and debt frameworks. Because most developed nations carry significant debt. The EU averages 88.5% debt to GDP. Canada sits at 106% gross debt. These are big numbers, but here's the thing. Markets don't just price how much you owe. They price whether you have a credible plan to manage it. And that distinction is where the United States is hemorrhaging credibility at an alarming rate. Let's start with Europe. The European Union operates under the revised Stability and Growth Pact. This isn't a suggestion. It's a legally binding framework. Deficits are capped at 3% of GDP. Debt targets sit at 60%. And when countries breach those limits, something actually happens. The excessive deficit procedure activates automatically. Not when politicians feel like it. Not after 6 months of congressional negotiations. Automatically. Right now, 10 EU member states are under active excessive deficit procedures. France has been mandated to keep net expenditure growth below 0.8% in 2025, rising to just 1.2% through 2029. Finland's cumulative net expenditure growth is capped at 2.5% for 2026. Belgium must limit growth to 3.6% in 2025, declining to 2.1% by 2029. These aren't talking points at press conferences. These are enforceable regulations with sanctions for non-compliance. The framework forces debt onto downward paths using stochastic debt sustainability analysis with 70% probability thresholds. Countries submit medium-term fiscal structural plans with binding net expenditure paths. Highly indebted nations must demonstrate plausibly downward debt trajectories or face real consequences. Now look across the Atlantic. What does America have? A debt ceiling, a political bargaining chip that gets suspended, raised, or ignored based entirely on who controls Congress. That's it. That's the entire fiscal discipline mechanism of the world's largest economy. The CBO projects, it advises, it warns, but it cannot compel a single dollar of fiscal correction. And Congress? Congress passes tax cuts without offsetting spending reductions and calls it economic policy. Now let's talk about Canada, because this is where the contrast becomes devastating for Washington. In the 1990s, Canada faced a genuine debt crisis. Debt to GDP exceeded 100%. The Wall Street Journal, and this is a real headline, called Canada an honorary member of the Third World and suggested it might need an IMF bailout. That's how bad it was. But here's what Canada did that the United States seems constitutionally incapable of doing. Ottawa responded with binding fiscal consolidation. $7 of spending cuts for every single dollar of tax increases. Not promises, not projected savings over a decade. Real, measurable, enforceable cuts. By 1999, Canada achieved a budget surplus. The framework worked because it was credible, because it was strict, and because it had teeth. Fast forward to today. According to the IMF, Canada's net debt to GDP ratio sits at just 14%. Let that sink in. 14% versus the G7 average of 95%. Canada achieves this through massive pension fund assets that offset gross debt, combined with federal fiscal frameworks that survived even the 2008 financial crisis intact. And bond markets see this. Canadian federal borrowing costs are now 1.2 percentage points lower than their U.S. equivalents. That's the widest spread since 1870. Markets aren't guessing anymore. They're pricing in a fundamental structural divergence between a country with fiscal discipline and a country without it. Here's where this gets truly alarming for the United States. By 2030, the CBO projects American debt will hit 108% of GDP, exceeding the 1946 post-war peak of 106%. But unlike 1946, when the U.S. had a booming industrial economy and a shrinking military budget to generate surpluses, there is no plausible downward path today. None. Interest payments alone will reach $2.1 trillion annually by 2036. That's roughly a fifth of all federal spending going to nothing but paying bondholders. Not schools, not infrastructure, not research, not defense, just interest. The Peterson Foundation, a nonpartisan organization, calculates this represents approximately $47,000 per person in net interest costs over the next decade. $16 trillion total, vanishing into debt servicing. And it gets worse. Administrative actions reducing immigration are projected to add $500 billion to the 10-year deficit. Fewer workers means fewer taxpayers. The working-age population will be roughly 2.4 million smaller by 2035 than previously forecast. Average monthly job growth between 2028 and 2036? Just 44,000. Barely enough to absorb new entrants to the labor force, let alone grow the tax base needed to service mounting debt. This is what a fiscal doom loop looks like. Declining credibility raises borrowing costs. Higher borrowing costs increase interest payments. Larger interest payments widen deficits. Wider deficits accelerate credibility loss, and the cycle repeats, faster each time. Now, is Europe perfect? No, not even close. France's debt is climbing from 116% toward a projected 129% by 2030. Italy sits at 137, Greece at 149. The Eurozone deficit is projected at 3.3% for 2026, with aggregate debt at nearly 90% of GDP. But here's the critical difference that changes everything. Markets know that France, Italy, Belgium, and the other 15 EU states under excessive deficit procedures face binding corrective paths. There is an institutional mechanism forcing eventual correction. When Germany's debt climbed from 64% to a projected 73%, markets knew Berlin would eventually face EU fiscal rules requiring adjustment. The framework creates predictability. Predictability creates confidence. Confidence keeps borrowing costs manageable. The United States has no equivalent. Zero. The CBO warns, Congress ignores, and debt continues to accelerate. The institutional divergence is becoming self-reinforcing, and bond markets are noticing. So what does this mean going forward? Here's what we're watching. The spread between U.S. Treasury yields and comparable Canadian and German bonds is going to keep widening. Markets are beginning to price American debt not as risk-free, but as framework-free. Debt issued by an entity with no binding fiscal constraints and no credible correction mechanism. The cascade effect will hit dollar reserve status. When central banks hold reserves, they're not just buying bonds, they're buying institutional predictability. Europe offers binding fiscal rules, transparent correction procedures, and enforceable deficit limits. Canada offers proven fiscal discipline and net debt ratios that make the rest of the G7 look reckless. The United States offers CBO warnings followed by political gridlock. We've covered how Europe is issuing European bonds instead of relying on U.S. treasuries. We've documented how nations are diversifying away from American financial infrastructure. This is the same pattern: systematic de-risking of American institutional credibility, accelerating in real time. Canada isn't panicking because Canada doesn't need to panic. Ottawa built the fiscal frameworks decades ago. The discipline is already embedded in the system. When the world starts asking who has their fiscal house in order, and that question is coming sooner than most people think, Canada's answer is already written in the data. The real question isn't whether America's $38.6 trillion in debt is too much. The real question is whether a country that refuses to build any mechanism to manage that debt can maintain the world's trust. And right now, the bond market's answer is getting louder by the day. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to Canada Next and hit that notification bell. We break down North American power dynamics with data, not drama. Well, maybe a little drama. Share this with someone who still thinks the U.S. debt ceiling counts as fiscal policy. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Is Washington capable of building real fiscal discipline, or is this trajectory locked in? I'll see you in the next one.